The nightclub's flashing lights and pounding bass felt like an assault on the senses. I slipped into the shadows, trying to make myself as invisible as possible among the sleek, glittering crowd. This wasn't my kind of place, not by a long shot, too much gloss, too much pretense. But I had a reason to be here tonight, and it was a reason that sat heavy in my chest like a stone. I wasn't here for the music or the drinks, I was here because of Taylor. And because I needed to know if what I feared was real. It had all started with a small suspicion, a nagging feeling that I tried to ignore at first. Taylor had changed recently in ways I couldn't pin down. She'd started going out late, getting dressed up more than usual, brushing off my questions with casual mentions of meeting friends. At first, I told myself I was overthinking things. After nearly 10 years of marriage, you trust the other person. You give them space, you give them the benefit of the doubt. But the signs kept piling up, one after another, refusing to be ignored. Then came the tipping point. I'd overheard a conversation, a snippet, about a woman seen at a local club, always cozying up to the owner. And when I heard Taylor's name come up, my stomach dropped like a lead weight. That's what led me here, to this glossy underworld, weaving through strangers as I searched for her. And there she was, sitting at the bar, surrounded by a faint glow that made her look ethereal. Stunning, even. She was laughing, something I hadn't seen her do with me in a long time, and leaning in close to a man beside her. I couldn't take my eyes off them. He was well dressed, exuding that air of self-assurance that some men carry like a second skin. His hand was resting on her thigh, casually, like he'd done it 100 times before. And she let him. Her body language was open, her gaze soft as she listened to whatever he was saying, a look she used to reserve for me. It was like watching someone tear the ground out from under me. I felt my jaw clench, a heat rising in my chest that threatened to choke me. The scene unfolding in front of me was a mockery, a betrayal of everything we'd built together. But as much as I wanted to charge over there, to call them both out in front of everyone, I held back. The anger that had gripped me moments before was settling into something colder, something clearer. If she thought she could do this, if she thought I'd just fade into the background, she had another thing coming. Instead of storming over, I stayed hidden, watching, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about pride. And I'd be damned if I'd let her walk away without consequence. I'd make sure that her lover felt the same fear, the same helplessness that was gnawing at me right now. The club's owner kept his hand on her knee, laughing, leaning closer. I forced myself to take note of every detail, storing it all away. Security was posted by the doors, the way the exit was tucked just out of sight. This was just the first step. If I was going to do this, I'd do it right. I'd be patient and careful. I wouldn't give her or her new friend the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. They'd both pay for this, in a way they'd never forget. I turned toward the exit, the cool night air hitting me like a splash of water, grounding me. I reached into my pocket and scrolled through my contacts until I landed on a name I hadn't thought about in years, Theo. We used to be close, back in the days when I was part of a world that played by different rules. A darker world I'd left behind. But Theo was still around, and he owed me a favor. If anyone knew how to handle this, how to send a message, it would be him. I hit call, and when he picked up, groggy but alert, I didn't waste time. "It's me," I said, my voice even. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end, then a low chuckle. "It's been a while, Garrett. Thought you'd cleaned up." "Something's come up," I replied, sharp. "I need someone who knows how to send a message." Theo was silent for a moment before responding. A dangerous edge to his tone. "Consider it done." I hung up, letting the phone drop back into my pocket as I walked away from the club. Tonight, I'd let them have their fun, let them believe they were untouchable. But it wouldn't last. Soon enough, they'd know what it meant to cross me, to treat me like a fool. And when that time came, I'd decide what was next, for both of us. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Taylor, leaning close to him, laughing like she hadn't in years. And that hand, his hand, resting on her leg like he owned her. The image wouldn't leave me. It fueled something dark and cold inside me, something I couldn't let go of until I took action. As soon as dawn broke, I was up, pouring a strong coffee and setting myself down at the table in my living room. In front of me was a blank notebook, except for one name, scratched across the top in dark, heavy letters, Ethan. The nightclub owner who thought he could move in on my life like I didn't exist. I began sketching a rough map of his club, remembering every detail from that night, the layout, the exits, the locations of his security. This place was going to be my staging ground. I'd turn it from his haven into a place of paranoia and fear. But first, I needed intel. I spent the morning reaching out to old contacts, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Most were surprised to hear from me, but I wasn't here to explain myself. I needed to know everything about Ethan, who he was, who he owed, and where his weak points lay. It didn't take long to get answers. Ethan was known for his flashy lifestyle, his cutthroat business deals, and a habit of racking up debts with some dangerous people. He wasn't untouchable, he was just good at hiding his cracks. Later that afternoon, I met Theo. We sat in a dim corner of a dive bar on the edge of town. He hadn't changed, still rough around the edges, a man who knew how to handle situations that called for subtlety, intimidation, and everything in between. "Didn't think I'd see you getting back into this kind of thing, Garrett," Theo said, sliding a whiskey toward me. "What's going on?" I took a slow sip, letting the burn sharpen my thoughts. "It's personal. My wife's seeing someone, a nightclub owner named Ethan." Theo raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And you want him handled?" "Not exactly." I met his gaze, steady. "I want him scared. I want him looking over his shoulder, questioning everything. I want him to feel like he's never safe, like every step he takes could be the wrong one." Theo's eyes gleamed with dark amusement. "Psychological warfare. I like it. What's the plan?" Together, we mapped it out carefully, piece by piece. I explained my first step. I wanted Theo to have a few of our old associates show up near the club, lingering in the shadows, watching. They'd make sure Ethan noticed them but wouldn't give him the chance to confront them. Just close enough to unsettle him. Leave cryptic notes where he'll find them. Nothing direct, just enough to make him feel targeted. "Watched," I told Theo. He nodded, that glint in his eyes sharpening. "What about his finances? You mentioned debts." I leaned in. "Find out who he owes and stir the pot. Make him feel like those debts are breathing down his neck, like they're closing in on him. He'll start to feel trapped." Theo's expression shifted, thoughtful. "Most men would just confront their wife, you know. But you want to dismantle this guy." "He crossed a line," I replied, my voice hard as stone. "And now, I'm drawing my own." We spent the next hour going over every detail. Theo's men would leave unsettling hints. Rumors whispered among his employees about an investigation, strange late-night calls that hinted at trouble. This would be a slow burn, but it would get under Ethan's skin. 2 nights later, the plan began to unfold. Theo's contacts made their presence felt around the club, shadowy figures just out of reach. By the end of the night, Ethan had doubled his security and even involved the police, who found nothing. Theo reported this to me the next morning, and I felt a surge of satisfaction. The first strike had hit. Over the next few nights, the pressure mounted. Cryptic messages appeared in his office, and rumors circulated about his growing debts. Each piece of the plan fell into place, unraveling Ethan's confidence bit by bit. But this wasn't just about breaking him. I wanted Taylor to see it too. I wanted her to start questioning the strength of the man she'd betrayed me for. On the 3rd night, I went to the club again, careful to stay out of sight. Across the street, I watched as Ethan pulled up in his sports car. He had that cocky smile again, but I could see something else there now: hesitation. The way he scanned his surroundings before heading inside. Just then, one of Theo's men appeared at the edge of his vision, lingering for just a moment before disappearing down an alley. I saw Ethan's expression falter, the confident mask slipping for just a moment. He was feeling it, the dread, the pressure. I watched for hours, noting the cracks forming in his composure. He moved through his club, strained, his gaze flicking constantly to the doors as if expecting a threat to walk right in. I recognized that creeping fear. It was the same feeling that had gripped me when I saw Taylor with him. The next day, Theo called with an update. Ethan was doubling down on his security and had confided in a few trusted employees about feeling watched. The bait was working, and I knew that soon enough, Taylor would begin to see through the cracks herself. This was only the beginning. She'd watch as the man she'd chosen over me stumbled, lost control, and became someone she couldn't trust to protect her. And when the time was right, I'd be there to watch her realization as her illusions shattered, piece by piece. I sat alone at the small cafe near Theo's place, nursing a cup of coffee. The bitter taste sharpened my focus, a feeling that kept me grounded as I went over the plan in my head one last time. Theo had texted just minutes ago, his men were in place. From the tinted windows of their cars, they'd be watching Ethan's club, lurking just enough to be noticed but not so much that they'd be questioned directly. This was psychological warfare, and I was just getting started. As the evening wore on, Theo called to confirm everything was set. "He's in there now," Theo said, his voice gruff and confident. "Looks like he's on edge already. First notes in place." I hung up and found myself smiling. Something cold and dark stirring inside me. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, it was something closer to satisfaction, a feeling that had eluded me since I discovered what was happening between my wife and that man. This first phase was designed to destabilize Ethan, to make him feel the slow creep of fear. By the time I made my way to the alley behind the club, the night had settled in. I positioned myself across the street, blending into the shadows as I watched. Ethan was visible through the tinted windows, moving through the club with a forced bravado. He was trying to keep it together, but I knew he'd seen the note by now, scrawled in a barely legible hand, "You can't escape what's coming." I'd left it in his office, where he'd be sure to see it alone. A single message, simple but loaded, placed in a spot only someone who knew his movements would leave it. His reaction was immediate, visible from here even if I couldn't make out the details of his expression. The club was crowded as usual, but there was tension in the air, a shift in the way Ethan moved. He looked at each of his employees as though they might be in on the message, glancing at corners as if he expected someone to be there. I leaned back against the cold wall of the building, waiting. It was like watching the first layer of paint peeling away from a surface, knowing it would take time but that eventually, everything beneath would be exposed. Theo's men had taken up positions in strategic spots outside and inside the club, slipping in just long enough to be noticed, exchanging the occasional hushed conversation with one another before fading back into the crowd. My phone buzzed. Another message from Theo. "He's spooked, boss." Pulled his security guy aside to ask if anyone was watching the place. A grim sense of triumph settled in my chest. Just as I'd planned, each small push was aimed at unsettling him, leaving Ethan questioning every move he made. He'd lose sleep, feel the slow creep of paranoia, wondering when, or if, something worse was coming. It was the same way I'd felt after that night I'd seen them together. But unlike me, he'd have nowhere to go with that unease. A few days passed, and I watched as Ethan's demeanor unraveled. He spent more time holed up in his office, only emerging with an eye on the entrance. His face grew paler, and I could tell he was slipping. Theo's updates came like clockwork, detailing every slip in Ethan's composure. Each morning, I'd wake to the news of a new message left for Ethan, on his desk. In the restrooms, on the mirror of his favorite corner booth. Simple, eerie reminders that something was coming for him. It won't end here. Soon. The satisfaction I felt grew, but so did something else. A sharper, bitter edge, knowing that this was still only a part of what he deserved. He thought he was untouchable, like he could toy with people's lives without consequence. But the cracks were showing now, and before long, he'd be looking over his shoulder every second. On the fifth night, I decided to escalate. The messages weren't enough anymore. I wanted Ethan to start feeling like his very life was at risk. I instructed Theo's men to go further. They'd arranged to confront Ethan subtly, an indirect threat. A shadowed figure near the entrance as he left for his car. A stranger lingering near his office when he left to handle business. The next night, I was there again, watching him. Ethan had doubled his security, and his once easy, careless smile had turned into a tense, guarded expression. He moved stiffly, shoulders high, glancing over his shoulder every time he thought no one was watching. For once, he wasn't the one in control of the room. I leaned against the wall outside the club, savoring the sight of him crumbling piece by piece. It wasn't long before Theo's men made their move, stepping into the club's entryway just long enough for Ethan to notice them. The look on his face, confused, pale, like he was seeing a ghost, was priceless. I knew he'd ask his guards about it later. And he'd get the same response, "Nobody there, boss." Ethan slipped into his office alone, no doubt to check for the latest message. Theo had slipped it in before he'd arrived that night. It's closer than you think. It was short, untraceable, just a hint that the danger was tightening around him. And with every new note, every shadowy figure, I knew he'd start to feel it. My presence, my anger, all coiled around him, waiting to strike. Watching him fall apart, little by little, made me feel alive again. It was twisted, I knew, but it was the only way I could begin to take back what he'd stolen from me. I could see it in her face, even before I'd asked the first question. Taylor's eyes had a glow that I hadn't seen in years, and I could feel the slow, bitter twist in my gut when I realized I wasn't the one who'd put it there. Ethan had dug his claws in, deeper than I'd expected. But if I was going to dismantle everything he'd built with her, I needed to understand exactly what Taylor saw in him, and how deep it went. That evening, we sat across from each other at the dinner table, a strained silence filling the space between us. I'd made her favorite, poured the wine, and put on the kind of music we used to enjoy. She smiled and made small talk, but I could tell her mind was somewhere else. Or with someone else. I cleared my throat, feigning a casual tone. So, you've been out quite a bit lately. Anything new on your mind? She looked at me, her expression guarded, as though she was waiting for a trap to snap shut. But I kept my gaze neutral, even leaning back a little, letting her think I was just interested in a simple conversation. She shrugged, fiddling with her wine glass. Not really. Work has just been stressful lately. Getting out helps. She forced a little laugh, but I could see the way her shoulders stiffened, a barely perceptible shift. I decided to press further, keeping my tone light. I don't blame you. Everyone needs a little escape from the day-to-day, right? And, hey, I know we both deal with things in our ways. She nodded, her gaze sliding away from mine. I could see the internal struggle on her face, the way she seemed to wrestle with her own words, debating just how much she could or couldn't say. Have you found anything that helps? I asked, trying to sound as distant as possible, like a curious observer. A new interest or, maybe a person? Her eyes flickered with something, a trace of excitement, barely contained beneath the careful facade she wore. And for just a second, she forgot to hide it, a faint smile slipping onto her lips. Maybe, she murmured, almost too softly to hear. But I caught it, and it made my hands clench under the table. So, I began slowly, hiding the strain in my voice. This person, are they good for you? Do they understand you? I felt sick asking, but I needed to see her reaction. She blinked, then looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass absently. Yeah, he listens, you know? Listens like he cares about what I have to say. The way she spoke was filled with a kind of reverence that made my stomach churn. She looked like she was confessing a secret she cherished, as if her connection with Ethan was something sacred. And she hadn't said his name, but she didn't need to. I knew exactly who she meant. Sometimes, she continued, her voice almost a whisper, it feels like he's the only person who gets me. He's different. Her eyes took on that distant look again, the one that told me she was somewhere else, thinking about him, picturing him. Different how? I pressed, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. She hesitated, clearly caught between her need to share and her instinct to hold back. He's not like anyone I've ever met. He's confident and he knows what he wants. I don't have to explain myself all the time. It's just easy with him. I clenched my jaw, feeling the weight of every word like a punch to the gut. She was so wrapped up in this fantasy of him that she didn't see the cracks, the facade Ethan put up to get what he wanted. She didn't realize how carefully crafted every piece of him was, how he'd played her, and she'd fallen for it, blind to his true nature, believing every lie he'd told her. And, is he really who you think he is? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral, even though the question dripped with bitterness. She looked at me, her brows drawn in confusion. What do you mean? I shrugged, trying to seem as casual as possible. I just mean, people aren't always what they seem. Sometimes we see what we want to see in someone, and, well, maybe we don't look too closely at who they are. Taylor's lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see her defenses going up. He's not perfect, she said finally, her tone defensive. But no one is. We all have flaws. And there it was. She was willing to defend him, even now, even when I was sitting right in front of her, her husband. She didn't care about his flaws because she saw them as quirks, things that made him unique. She was so infatuated, so enamored, that she'd accept him as he was, no matter what. It's good you see that, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. Just, don't let yourself get hurt, okay? Her eyes softened a bit, and for a moment, I almost believed she was looking at me with genuine concern. I'm fine, Garrett. Really. I'm just figuring things out. I nodded, letting her believe I was satisfied with that answer, that I was just the supportive husband trying to make sense of her emotional state. But as I sat there, watching her get lost in thoughts of him again, I knew that she wasn't going to see him for who he was anytime soon. Taylor's faith in Ethan was absolute. She had fallen headfirst into his trap, and nothing I could say would make her doubt him. I felt my stomach turn, a renewed sense of determination solidifying in my chest. She was blind to his manipulation, but I wasn't. And if she wouldn't open her eyes, then I'd be the one to show her exactly who Ethan was. That night, after Taylor went to bed, I sat alone in the darkened living room, feeling a simmering resolve deep within me. The plan with Theo would continue. But now there was a new purpose behind it. I wasn't just tearing down Ethan's world for my satisfaction. I was going to force her to see him for who he was. I'd dismantle every illusion she had of him, strip him down piece by piece until there was nothing left but the empty shell underneath. And when her world shattered, when the veil finally lifted, I'd be there to watch her realize what she'd traded us for. Ethan thought he was untouchable, but he'd built his empire on a shaky foundation, leaving plenty of gaps I could exploit. I intended to make him feel the weight of every single one of those vulnerabilities. If Taylor wanted to worship this man as some sort of flawless idol, she was about to watch him crack. The first hit was subtle. Just a few rumors, nothing too pointed. Theo and I worked it carefully, making sure the whispers were enough to spread like wildfire. A few well-placed contacts leaked the idea that Ethan's nightclub wasn't just a hotspot for nightlife but had some unsavory affiliations. These things had a way of spiraling, especially when you gave people's imaginations a bit of fuel. By the end of the week, whispers had morphed into outright accusations. As for Ethan, he had no idea where it was coming from. At first, he dismissed it, brushing off the rumors as jealousy from other business owners. But soon, I could see the cracks forming. Theo's reports told me that complaints were starting to roll in from the club's usual crowd. Some customers were even muttering about boycotting him. I imagined his smug confidence being chipped away piece by piece, his carefully built empire teetering on the edge. It wasn't enough to ruin him, not yet, but it was enough to make him feel like he was under siege, like everything he'd built could slip through his fingers at any moment. But a few bad rumors wouldn't be enough. Ethan needed to understand the stakes, to feel that sense of danger every time he left his club, every time he stepped out into the city. So I set up the next part of the plan. It was a late Friday night when Theo's guys followed Ethan out of the club. They didn't confront him directly. No, this was going to be more subtle, just a brush with fear to remind him he was never alone. Ethan walked out with that usual swagger, his head held high, too arrogant to see the shadows lurking just behind him. The first contact came when he cut through the parking lot toward his car. One of Theo's men, someone tall and broad with a face hardened by years in the business, made sure to get close enough to brush past Ethan as he walked. Just a graze of a shoulder, a bit too close for comfort, and enough to make Ethan pause. But he wouldn't be too suspicious. Not yet. A few blocks down, Ethan veered into a small side street, taking a shortcut through the quieter part of town. It was dark here, barely lit by a few flickering street lamps. Theo's men knew the streets well enough to anticipate Ethan's route, appearing here and there at just the right moments, their faces shadowed, never lingering long enough for him to get a good look. It was when Ethan neared his car that Theo's men stepped into his path. He kept it simple, his voice a low, warning tone. "Watch where you step. People don't take kindly to those who don't pay their dues." Ethan stopped, a flicker of confusion and fear crossing his face. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, a forced confidence in his voice. Theo's man just gave a faint, humorless smile. "You don't have to know. But remember, some debts don't go away." And then, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone, staring after him with wide eyes, his hand hovering near his pocket where his phone was, probably weighing whether to call the police or just get out of there as fast as possible. I could practically feel his fear, his confusion as he tried to piece together what had just happened. He'd tell himself it was a random encounter, some late-night drifter looking to intimidate him. But the words would linger, crawling under his skin. The following day, Theo reported that Ethan was scrambling. His usual calm, charming exterior was cracking. He'd called a few of his contacts, trying to get information, but no one knew anything, leaving him with nothing but questions. And while he was occupied dealing with the strange men lurking near his club and the rumors tainting his reputation, I set up the final phase of this round. It didn't take much effort to fan the flames further. A couple of well-placed calls to key people, a few casual hints that Ethan's club was under the watchful eye of certain business associates from across town. Customers began to talk, the gossip spilling into places it normally wouldn't reach. Soon, people who once vied to get past the velvet ropes started keeping their distance, uncertain of what kind of crowd might be slipping through those doors. I watched it unfold from a distance, satisfied to see the once bustling line outside his club start to thin out. People don't like feeling unsafe, especially when they're there to drink and let loose. The threat of something darker tainting their night wasn't worth it. Ethan must have felt it too. His club was his fortress, and it was slowly becoming something he couldn't control. I knew he was looking over his shoulder now, jumping at shadows, wondering if that figure lingering outside was just another customer or something more sinister. I sat back, watching as his world started to unravel, feeling the satisfaction of every inch of fear I'd managed to drive into him. Soon, Taylor would see the man she'd chosen wasn't the confident, secure figure she thought he was. I waited for the right moment, choosing a quiet evening when his club was still getting its usual crowd but hadn't reached peak capacity. I slipped into the darkened alley by the side entrance, waiting for him to make his routine checks. He walked out just after 10, his eyes darting around, the wariness painfully obvious. He took a few steps into the alley, maybe to check his surroundings or get a breath of fresh air, and that's when I stepped into his path. "Ethan," I said, keeping my voice low but steady, savoring the surprise and flicker of fear in his eyes as he looked up at me. He tried to mask it, but I saw right through him. He gave a quick, tense nod. You're Garrett, right?" "That's right," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on him. "I think it's time we had a little talk." His face tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the entrance as if calculating his escape route. "Look, if you have an issue with the club, I'd rather we handle it professionally," he said, trying to keep his voice even. But I could see the edge of uncertainty there, that underlying crack I'd spent so long cultivating. "Oh, it's not the club I'm here about," I replied calmly. "It's something, or rather, someone, we both have a vested interest in." He stilled, his mask slipping for just a moment, giving me a glimpse of the anxiety buried beneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone laced with forced bravado. "Let's not play games, Ethan." I took a step closer, watching as he involuntarily stepped back, his gaze flicking to the side as if looking for an exit. "I know about you and Taylor. And I know you've been feeling a little watched lately." I saw his throat work as he swallowed, trying to maintain his composure. "Look, if this is some kind of threat." "It's not a threat," I interrupted smoothly, my voice lowering. "It's a reality check. You're way over your head, Ethan. Do you think you can keep Taylor safe? That you can handle whatever this is?" He blinked, and I caught the fear in his eyes, the fear that he was losing control, that he couldn't protect her, no matter how much he wanted to believe he could. "Leave her out of this," he said, his voice rough, but I could hear the desperation under the bravado. "Leave her out of this?" I echoed, my voice soft but laced with venom. "You should have thought of that before you decided to step into someone else's life. This isn't some game you're playing. People know about you, they're watching, and it won't be long before they close in." The color drained from his face, and he glanced down, unable to meet my gaze. For the first time, I saw a man stripped of his confidence, faced with the harsh reality of his situation. He wasn't the bold nightclub owner anymore. He was just another man who'd made a mistake, who'd overestimated himself and now was grappling with consequences he couldn't control. I leaned in, keeping my voice cold and steady. "If I were you, I'd start rethinking my decisions. Because once people like us are out there, once they're after you, there's no going back. And Taylor? She won't be able to help you. You won't even be able to help yourself." I stepped back, letting my words sink in, watching as he processed the weight of it. I saw the panic settle in his eyes, the terror of a man who suddenly realizes he's in over his head. I turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the alley, trapped in the fear I'd created. Later, as I watched him from across the street, I saw the signs of his unraveling. He was pacing, his eyes darting wildly, his fingers digging into his hair as he spoke frantically into his phone. Taylor would be the next one to feel it, to see this hollow shell of a man and realize that he wasn't the confident lover she thought he was. That her fantasy was just that, a fantasy that was about to come crashing down, along with everything she'd built on it. The cracks were spreading. Taylor had always been perceptive, especially when it came to men like Ethan. She thrived on confidence and charm, and for a while, he'd given her exactly that: smooth words, steady assurances, an escape from what she thought was a stagnant life. But as I'd watched over the past days, her expression had changed. There was doubt there now, a sliver of unease she couldn't quite hide. The man she thought she knew was slipping from her grasp, and I was giving her front row seats to the descent. Taylor finally reached her limit that night. I stayed nearby, close enough to see them together in the dimly lit corner of his office. He looked worse than ever, hunched shoulders, shifting eyes, and a tremor in his hand as he took a sip of his drink. Even his well-groomed appearance, something he always prioritized, seemed neglected. His tie was crooked, his sleeves rumpled. He'd been unraveling bit by bit, and tonight he looked like he was barely holding on. "Ethan," she murmured, reaching across the table to touch his hand. He barely glanced at her, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "What's going on with you?" Her voice held a note of desperation. "You've been so different. Distant. Is something wrong?" He stiffened, pulling his hand from hers. "Nothing's wrong," he said quickly, too quickly, and she frowned. "Don't lie to me," she pressed, her voice soft but insistent. "I can tell something's eating at you. You're not yourself, Ethan." She leaned closer, trying to catch his eye. "Is it the business? Or is it us?" The question seemed to rattle him. He swallowed, rubbing a hand over his face, but he didn't meet her gaze. "Taylor, it's not. It's complicated. Just leave it alone, all right?" A flicker of hurt crossed her face, but she didn't back down. "Ethan, if something's wrong, I want to help. Just tell me what's going on. Please." But he only shook his head, retreating further, a shadow of the man he'd once been. "I don't want to talk about it." I watched her leave a short while later, the defeat in her posture evident. Whatever hold he'd had on her was weakening. She was realizing, slowly but surely, that Ethan couldn't be the escape she'd imagined. The confidence that had drawn her in was gone, replaced by a man who was consumed by fear and paranoia. And I was going to make sure that fear isolated him completely. Over the next week, I set the final steps in motion. Ethan's support network was going to crumble, and he'd have no one left to turn to. I made sure rumors spread through his staff, subtle hints of criminal ties and impending investigations, enough to make them question their loyalty to him. The whispers grew louder, passing from person to person until even his most loyal employees started to keep their distance. One of his managers quit after a conversation with one of my contacts, a man who'd hinted at the dangers of working for a man who was in over his head. Soon, others followed, claiming sick days, stepping back from shifts, citing vague concerns over security. The club that had once been Ethan's pride, his safe ground, now felt empty and desolate. As reports of his troubles reached me, I savored the knowledge. His staff was abandoning him, his reputation was tarnished, and the few contacts he still had were keeping their distance, wary of being dragged into the mess. He'd alienated Taylor and lost his grip on the business he thought was his foundation. Piece by piece, everything was slipping from his grasp. One evening, I watched him from the shadows outside his club. He was standing alone, his phone to his ear, a desperate look on his face as he tried to reach someone, anyone, for help. But no one was answering. His contacts were gone, his employees barely trusted him, and the woman he'd stolen from me was beginning to see him for who he truly was: weak, broken, and utterly alone. When he finally gave up and slumped against the wall, I turned and walked away, satisfied. The man who'd taken so much from me was isolated now, surrounded by shadows and haunted by threats. Soon, he would have nowhere left to run. The nights grew darker, and with each passing day, the tension between Taylor and Ethan escalated. What had started as a thrilling affair was unraveling into a nightmare, and I could feel the weight of their unspoken fears hanging heavy in the air. It was one of those late evenings when the rain fell in sheets, drumming against the windows of Ethan's apartment. I watched from a distance, waiting for the moment when Taylor would recognize the shift in Ethan's demeanor. They'd barely spoken for hours, and I could see him pacing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, muttering to himself. "Ethan, please." Taylor's voice broke through the oppressive silence, rising just enough for me to catch snippets of their conversation. You're scaring me. He stopped, spinning to face her, and I saw the wild look in his eyes. Scaring you? I'm the one who has to deal with all this. You don't understand what's at stake. I leaned closer, straining to hear every word. But you're not dealing with it. You're just pushing me away. I could feel Taylor's desperation as she stepped back, her voice trembling. I don't know what's happening to you, but it feels dangerous. I feel dangerous. Ethan's expression shifted. I could almost sense the crack forming in his bravado. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by something more familiar, anger. You think you know danger? You don't know the half of it. I leaned back, a dark satisfaction brewing within me. He was losing control. Each confrontation was pushing them further apart, and I relished the idea that my plan was working. The excitement that had once drawn her to him was now obscured by the fear creeping into her heart. As the rain continued to beat against the glass, I couldn't help but think about how Taylor must feel. Trapped, cornered. I had to remind myself that this was part of his own making. Days turned into an agonizing cycle of anticipation and manipulation. I kept my distance, watching through the veil of shadows as the tension in their lives mounted. I could see the signs. Ethan's pacing grew more frantic. His phone calls muffled and hurried, and Taylor's demeanor shifted from carefree to anxious. One night, as I sat in my car across the street, I caught sight of her peering through the window, concern etched into her features. I smirked, knowing she was beginning to understand the fragility of her situation. Ethan was not the rock she had thought he was nothing but a paper tiger, collapsing under the weight of his lies. Then came the moment that solidified my sense of victory. I orchestrated a chance encounter for Taylor while she was out shopping. Theo's men made their presence known, subtle enough to be overlooked but close enough to send a clear message. I watched from my hidden vantage point as they lingered, their figures cloaked in the shadows. Taylor didn't see the intimidation, but I knew she felt it, the way her shoulders tensed, her hand instinctively tightening around her purse as she hurried to her car. The fear would linger, and I was certain it would seep into her interactions with Ethan. As the days passed, the impact of my plan took shape. Rumors began swirling around Ethan's club. I set it in motion, feeding information to those who had reason to doubt him, painting him as a man with ties to criminal elements. It was like a slow poison, eating away at his reputation. Customers complained, and the whispers began to echo through the halls of his once thriving business. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could see it gnawing at Ethan. I pictured him pacing in his office, sweat glistening on his brow as he fielded calls from panicked employees and disgruntled clients. Every move he made now came with the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, and I could feel Taylor's worries escalating. She was watching him pull further away, the cracks in his facade deepening. He no longer carried the same bravado, he was becoming withdrawn and anxious, and I knew that soon enough, she would realize the truth. Then came the turning point. I decided it was time to confront Ethan directly, to push him even closer to the brink. One night, I sauntered into his club, feigning casual indifference. The bass thumped around me, and the strobe lights flickered like chaotic thoughts. I spotted him across the room, his back turned to me, trying to hold court with some of the patrons, but he was visibly shaken, scanning the crowd as if he expected trouble to find him. I approached him, my presence a shadow against the brightness of the bar. "Ethan," I said, keeping my tone low and steady, just loud enough to cut through the noise. He turned, his eyes widening at the sight of me. I watched as recognition flickered across his face, morphing into fear. "What are you doing here, Garrett?" I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know why I'm here. I'm aware of what you've been up to with Taylor." His gaze darted around, searching for an escape, but I had cornered him in a way he didn't expect. "I know you think you can keep her safe, but she's caught in the middle of something she doesn't understand." Get out," he hissed, but the panic in his eyes betrayed his bravado. I smiled, letting the words linger. "You can't control this situation anymore, Ethan. You're in over your head, and soon, she'll see you for who you really are." I turned to walk away, feeling the weight of his terrified gaze on my back. I could sense the ripple of fear that I had instilled in him. He was unraveling, and I knew it would only take a little more pressure for everything to collapse around him. As I watched from a distance, I realized the irony of it all. Taylor believed she had traded safety for passion, but the truth was that her life was now teetering on the edge of chaos. Soon, she would come to me, seeking refuge from the storm that was Ethan. I would be waiting for her, ready to welcome her back into the fold. The man who had betrayed me would be left broken and alone, and I would take back what was mine. The days dragged on, each one a meticulously crafted step in a dance I had choreographed with precision. My efforts to isolate Ethan had borne fruit. Rumors about his ties to criminal gangs swirled around him like a dark cloud. And I reveled in the chaos I had sown. It was beautiful to watch, each moment bringing me closer to the inevitable confrontation with Taylor. Then, the moment came. I received a call from Theo late one evening, his voice low and cautious. "Garrett, Taylor's been asking about you. She's worried about Ethan. He's been acting strange, more erratic. I think she's starting to see through the facade." I couldn't suppress a smile. This was the culmination of my plan. Taylor was finally questioning the stability of the man she had chosen. I spent the next few days waiting, biding my time until I felt the moment was right. That Friday night, I arranged to meet her at our old spot, a quiet cafe tucked away from the chaos of the city. It had been a place where we had shared dreams and laughter before everything crumbled. I wanted to remind her of what we had before the darkness enveloped us both. When she walked in, the familiar warmth flooded back. But there was something different about her. Her eyes were wide, apprehensive, darting around as if expecting shadows to emerge from every corner. She approached the table slowly, uncertainty etched into her features. "Garrett," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from me. "I've been trying to reach you." "Have you?" I replied, my voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "What's on your mind?" Her gaze faltered, and for a moment, I thought she might break. "It's Ethan," she confessed. "He's not who I thought he was. I feel trapped." I leaned in, my expression carefully composed. "What do you mean, trapped? I've seen how he's changed. He's not the confident man I fell for. He's paranoid and anxious, and I don't think he can protect me like I thought he could." She shook her head, frustration evident in her voice. "He's pulling away, and it scares me." "Why do you think that is?" I asked, feigning ignorance while my heart raced with anticipation. "Because he knows he's losing control," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of cups and quiet conversations surrounding us. "And I'm scared of what that means for me." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "You don't need to be scared, Taylor. You have options." Her eyes met mine, searching for something, reassurance, perhaps. "I don't want to be alone." "Not again." "Then don't be." My voice dropped to a whisper, laced with intent. "You know where I stand. I've always cared for you. I'm here. I've always been here." Tears welled in her eyes, and at that moment, I saw the flicker of realization dawning upon her. "Garrett, I made a mistake." Her voice trembled, and I could see the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. "I should have never let him come between us." "You were blinded by something that felt real," I replied, keeping my tone even, "but the truth is, Ethan was never who you thought he was. I've seen him for what he is, a coward, a man without a foundation." "I know that now," she said, her voice breaking. "I want to come back to you." A cold satisfaction washed over me. She had finally seen through the veil of deception. And the victory was sweet. But as I watched her struggle with her emotions, a flicker of doubt gnawed at my insides. I had orchestrated this downfall, but could I truly forgive her? My heart wrestled with the weight of her betrayal. Part of me wanted to pull her close, to reclaim what we had lost. Yet another part, a darker part, felt the sting of my own hurt and anger. "Do you really want to return?" I asked, my voice low. "Because if you do, you need to understand that it won't be easy. You have to choose, me, or the chaos that you've let into your life." "I choose you," she said, her words tumbling out like a desperate promise. "I'm so sorry for what I did. I was weak." "Then we'll rebuild from this," I said, feeling the heaviness of my decision settling over me. "But understand this, Taylor, there's no going back to how things were. This is a new beginning, and it's going to require strength from both of us." As we sat there, the tension between us shifted, charged with unspoken possibilities. I wanted to forgive her, to bring her back into the fold. I could feel my resolve starting to crack under the weight of my desire to protect her, to love her again. But I also felt the flicker of a darker resolve, a temptation to let her feel the sting of fear for a little while longer, a reminder of what she had lost. Would it be enough for her to truly appreciate what it meant to be with me again? The choice was mine to make. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch between us, the weight of my thoughts swirling like smoke in the dim light. I had her where I wanted her, and now, I had to decide whether to forgive or to let her feel the chill of my absence just a little longer. At that moment, I felt powerful, but I also knew that power could be intoxicating. As I looked into her eyes, I saw vulnerability and fear mingling with love, and I realized I could either heal her or leave her shattered. The night stretched on, full of unspoken words and the possibility of a new beginning. The question lingered: how far was I willing to go to reclaim what was mine?